history in this church. And since this weekend traditionally lifts up the nation's history as we celebrate Independence Day, I thought I'd try and connect the two. 4th of July celebrations have long been a favorite of mine. As a child, I liked the abundance of summer treats on the holidays, like watermelons, strawberries, hot dogs, ice cream, lemonade. And as a young adolescent, I liked all the fireworks, the sparks and flames and pops and bangs. And not too long after that, when I got old enough to value history, I started to appreciate all our founders went through and the radical nature of declaring independence from what was then the world's most dominant empire. And it was somewhere back in those adolescent years that I first found the soaring words in the famous opening sentence to the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, writing a truth for me that has never been unwrung. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with these certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And while I appreciate that 2 decades later the Constitution provided a needed separation of church and state, in 1776, that sentence in the preamble was packed densely with theology. And I'm not sure if Thomas Jefferson would agree, but I would even go so far as to say those words he penned and our founding fathers signed are a fair and eloquent summation of how Jesus' teachings are meant to play out. It's what loving our neighbor and doing to others what we want done to ourselves looks like. Declaring and treating all as created equal by God and as entitled to intrinsic God-given rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is very much in line with Jesus' words and Jesus' way. And in our lesson from Luke today, we hear how Jesus started his ministry with good news, not unlike that in the Declaration of Independence. Jesus and our nation can be said to have started off seeking liberty and justice for all. And of course, even as our nation has celebrated the beautiful words of the Declaration of Independence and our nation's churches have lauded the teachings of Jesus, we have in reality yet to come close to fully living into either. And while we have come a long way from the days when enslavement of humans was lawful and a drastic inequality between white males and everyone else was a lawful norm, of late we've been backsliding on much of the progress we made and backsliding on the promises of those beautiful words and the love-centered teachings of Jesus. For years, diversity, equity, and inclusion work has slowly seemed to be making headway toward playing out the truth that all are created equal and entitled to the same God-given rights. And today's movements in politics and churches that claim to be patriotic and religious while challenging equality and rights for everyone sure seem to be anti the promise of the Declaration of Independence and anti-Jesus teachings. Both the Declaration and Jesus unequivocally call for equality and for God-given rights and well-being. And Americans don't have to be liberal or moderate or conservative to hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Christians don't have to be liberal or moderate or conservative to believe in the need to love our neighbor as ourselves and to do to others what we want done to ourselves. I frankly don't understand how any follower of Jesus could be against waking to the need to love our neighbors and waking to the need to do to others what we want done to ourselves. And likewise, I don't understand how any person claiming to be patriotic could be against waking to the need for equality and rights that our nation was founded on. For 249 years, those ideals have been American ideals. The Declaration of Independence was and remains a clarion call to those ideals. The First Congregational Church of Stockton, at the end of the Civil War, was founded by Americans with such ideals. And the church has a long and impressive history in this county of pursuing them, especially, of course, Jesus' teachings that influence the words in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. Local history books indicate that in 1865, from the start, as Congregationalists, we were formed with a purpose of returning to those, quote, first principles both in faith and ardor, which were given by Christ and his apostles, end quote. And those principles have guided this faith community for 160 years, and they guide us to this day. We understand them to require us to, above all else, love God and love our neighbors. And those teachings by Jesus and the apostles have led this church to be at the forefront of justice issues in San Joaquin County during much of its past. Here are some shining examples from back in the day. In the mid-19th century, California had many immigrants arrive during the gold rush, including those with American heritage and Chinese heritage. Arriving in San Francisco, immigrants would often travel through Stockton on the way up to the gold country, and many actually ended up living here. By 1850, the year California became a state, Stockton was a primary location for Chinese immigrants. And another wave of Chinese immigrants arrived in the 1860s to work on the growing intercontinental railroad network. So white Americans who immigrated to Stockton grew hostile toward Chinese immigrants in the early decades of our state. In 1880, the racial resentment in the area boiled over in a very, very ugly anti-Chinese rally at our city hall. It took place on October 22nd, 1880. And the rally led to the city passing what were purposely called devilishly uncomfortable ordinances meant to force residents with Chinese heritage to leave. Those ordinances restricted housing, businesses, and social interaction. Things like prohibiting Chinese children from attending white schools, like prohibiting laundries, fishing, ethnic hairstyling, living north of City Hall, and interracial marriages. Heavier taxes were also imposed on Chinese immigrant minors. And the ordinances were aimed at forcing those with Chinese heritage to self-deport out of Stockton. On October 7, 1880, just 16 days after Stockton's notorious 1880 anti-Chinese meeting, our church took a remarkable stand and became the first Christian faith community in Stockton to baptize and welcome into full membership two men with Chinese heritage, Ah Hung and Lu Hang. And then tragically, less than 13 days later, the pastor of our church, Reverend David Temple Packard, was in a fatal carriage accident on its way to a funeral for a Catholic man that his priest refused to bury. And no writing in the paper or books hint at Reverend Packard's death being more than an accident, but given the very anti-Chinese time, I have some doubt, especially since at the time the Klan in California targeted those with Chinese heritage and their supporters. And whether his death was an accident or not, Reverend Packard is a saint for courageously leading the way to opening the doors and membership for those two new members, Ah Hung and Lu Hang. And Reverend Packard's efforts seem to propel the church into new levels of justice and kindness and humble walks with God, because at least by 1889, we were not only working with the Chinese American community, we were swapping pulpits and working with the Jewish community. that 19th century justice work we did is the stuff, the words of the Declaration of Independence and the teachings of Christ and the apostles led us to and lead us to. And skipping ahead to the early 20th century, sadly, prejudice toward those with Japanese heritage was now occurring. Children in Stockton schools were actually taught that the Japanese were a natural enemy. And in 1913, the infamous California Asian Land Law prohibited Japanese immigrants from owning land on the Delta. And by 1919, anti-Japanese organizations arose and continued to oppose those with Japanese heritage from having orchards and farms. And after Pearl Harbor, in December of 1941, prejudice against residents with Japanese heritage exploded, leading early in 1942 to the infamous Executive Order 9066, mandating internment of all Japanese American citizens and immigrants. And well over 100,000 men, women, and children were relocated across the country and incarcerated in internment camps. Businesses were boarded up, families were split, lives were traumatically and unjustly altered. And our church, led by Reverend Dr. Noel Breed, openly opposed those oppressions. And the congregation helped those being unjustly whisked away to camps by storing their belongings in our church basement. That's the stuff the words of our Declaration of Independence and the teachings of Christ and the apostles led us to and lead us to. In the 1940s, Reverend Breed and the church also led the way in forming the city's first ever interracial council. And the church actively participated in the civil rights movement throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And in the 1970s, we were also involved in justice work for women. We housed and we supported the Stockton Women's Center. And as we heard from Tony a couple of weeks ago, our church has also been involved in LGBTQ plus justice work for decades. Long ago, we became an LGBTQ plus friendly church. And near the turn of the century, we hired our first openly gay pastor. And a decade ago, we made official what we've long been and formally became a UCC open and affirming church. And last week, we moved church to the San Francisco Pride Parade, sending our pastor and a contingent of half our regular attendees to participate. Sending us there was an animation of the body of Christ. Our justice work continues as advocates and allies for LGBTQ+, for women, for African Americans, for people of color, for immigrants, for those with disabilities, and for those experiencing housing and food insecurities. That's the stuff, the words of our Declaration of Independence and the teachings of Christ and the apostles led us to and lead us to. As small as we are, we continue to try and follow that lead. In addition to what I've already mentioned, we also sponsor and participate in Family Promise, an organization of faith communities that helps feed and house families. We're doing that next week. And every other week we make sandwiches for distribution to those in need. We're doing that this week. And this past year we have supported Second Harvest, St. Mary's Community Services, and Valley Ministries Pantry, local entities that fight hunger. We adopted a family in need at Christmas and generously provided gifts. This year we've made efforts to reconnect with both Stockton Pride Center and the Central Valley Gender Health and Wellness Center. We support and we participate in efforts for LGBTQ plus justice at this critical time. And we support and we participate in efforts for racial justice in this critical time. We honor the work and words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. We honor and we remember Black History Month, and we were closed on Juneteenth in commemoration of that holiday. And we're planning and hoping to lead an interfaith effort to have overcoming racism classes in the community, which I hope as many of you as possible participate in. Quite often, in our worship services and sermons, we have issues about social justice lifted up and raised and prayed for. And all of this stuff is the stuff, the words of our Declaration of Independence and the teachings of Christ and the apostles led us to and lead us to. The history of First Congregational Church of Stockton indicates we have long held these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal and provided and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Here in this church, we have long believed in the need to love our neighbor as ourselves and to do to others what we want done to ourselves. Our history bears this out. Our present bears this out. And our future, with the help of God and the help of all of us, promises to bear this out for decades more to come. May it be so.